I do not know if this is the right place in the overarching argument I'm making to talk about divine sovereignty and human freedom, but that's what I'm going to do now. The Bible gives certain passages which seem to teach that God is sovereign, that he is in total control of all things. And yet, there are other passages which seem to teach that man has libertarian freedom. Traditionally, this theological controversy has been framed as Calvinism versus Arminianism. Now, it is a bit tricky to nail down exactly what is meant by Calvinism or by Arminianism, at least for me it is. I have heard sympathetic and unsympathetic people alike speaking on Calvinism or on Arminianism, and what they are talking about is very different from how I have understood the terms. Mayhaps my theological understanding is not totally accurate, so take my description of Calvinism and of Arminianism in this video, in this series, with a grain of salt. Definition of Calvinism: the view that God is in control of all things that happen, with the possible exception of human and demonic acts of sin, and man is free to choose among various free acts so long as he does not go against his totally depraved nature. There is more to Calvinism than just this, but Calvinism includes this much, at least I think. The important part of this definition for our purposes here is that man must act within his totally depraved nature. Man is free to do whatever he wants, but he only wants to sin. I suppose we could choose between miscellaneous sins and sometimes even choose to not sin at all in particular situations on the Calvinistic view. But what the non-Christian can never do, according to Calvinism, is freely choose to follow Christ. The definition of Arminianism now: the view that while God is sovereign, as the Calvinist maintains, he is not sovereign in quite the same sense that Calvinists understand that term. Rather, the Calvinist view of sovereignty is too strong, for God has sovereignly decreed in his omnipotence that man shall have total or libertarian free will. So then, Calvinism stresses God's sovereignty over human freedom, and Arminianism stresses human freedom over divine sovereignty. At least this seems to be what the disagreement boils down to. Both admit a kind of sovereignty, and both admit a sort of human freedom. I would like to propose a third view, a middle way. Why make the teachings of Scripture harder than they are? If the Bible teaches God is sovereign and man is free, why not just take that at face value? This view is called Molinism, after a Jesuit monk whose name was Molina, Louis D. Molina. Now, the definition of Molinism, as I understand the term: God has what is called middle knowledge as part of his omniscience. He thus knows what we would freely choose in any particular situation. He can sovereignly create the actual world to be such that we are in the circumstances where we freely choose, with libertarian freedom, what God has predetermined that we will choose. I think we ought to resist the temptation to suppose that such a tangled Gordian knot could be could be untied so easily by merely taking the Bible at face value. Is God sovereign? Yes. Is man free? Yes. As this idea is fleshed out, we find something like the above definition of Molinism. At least that is the story. But is the story true? More precisely, does the Bible itself teach Molinism, as I've defined it above? Well, we know from both general and special revelation that God is omniscient. This means that God has all knowledge. But if God has all knowledge, then he certainly has one particular kind of knowledge, namely middle knowledge. But what is middle knowledge? Definition of middle knowledge: knowledge of what any particular being, which may or may not actually exist at the then present, would do in any logically possible situation. So what a being would do in any possible situation, that is what middle knowledge is. Knowledge of what the being would do in a particular situation, if the being was faced with that situation. There are clear examples of ascription of such knowledge to God within the Bible. The first example is when Abraham is bartering with God over the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah. The conclusion of that dialogue presents God as saying, quote, "If I find there are only 10 righteous people in the city, I will not destroy it," unquote. Of course, God already knew there were not 10 righteous people there. However, if there had been at least 10, I take it that God would not have destroyed the city. So in addition to Lot's family, if Abraham and his own family were there, say, then God knows he would not destroy that place. Another example, Christ is rebuking some people when he says, quote, "Tyre and Sidon would have repented if they had seen the miracles you have seen." He followed this up with, quote, "So they shall rise up to judge you on the great day," unquote. Well, this is an expression of divine middle knowledge. In another possible world, Tyre and Sidon would have been visited by Jesus, seen his miracles, and as a result, repented to avoid their destruction. To speak of other possible worlds brings up the whole notion of modal logic. I used modal logic when I presented the ontological argument in a previous video. If you'd like to go back and watch that, maybe that'll give you some more insight into what I'm talking about here. The basic idea of modal logic is that there are many different worlds which are all logically possible. That is, the actual world could have been different than it in fact is. These different worlds have certain relations to one another, and what is logically true or false can vary from one world to another. A logical truth is possible, possibly true, if and only if it is true in at least one world. It is impossible if and only if it is true in no world. Finally, a truth is necessary if and only if it is true in all the worlds. And we said, when we were talking about the ontological argument, that God's existence is necessary. So he exists in every logically possible world. So much for middle knowledge. The next point of interest in the definition of Molinism is freedom of the will. We know that libertarian freedom is taught in the Bible because the Bible teaches human culpability. If we are held accountable for our sinful actions, then we are free to not sin. We are held accountable, and so, by modus ponens, we are free to not sin. Let me say that again. The Bible teaches, let's see, if we are held accountable for our human if we are held accountable for our sinful actions, then we are free to not sin. We are held accountable, and so, by modus ponens, we are free to not sin. If P then Q, and P therefore Q. If we are free to sin or not sin, then we have libertarian freedom. I am not saying here that man is not totally depraved. What I am saying is that we find libertarian freedom in the Bible, so that part of the definition of Molinism is consistent with the Bible itself. The last concept to examine with respect to the definition is predestination. We know the sacrificial atonement of Christ was planned before the beginning of time, planned by God before the beginning of time. The names of Christians, we also read in Scripture, are written in the Lamb's Book of Life. Finally, in the Pauline epistles, we read of the righteous acts that God has determined for us to do beforehand. So yes, there is some sort of predestination or predeterminism taught in Scripture, though not, I think, the Calvinistic sort. Putting it all together, the doctrine of Molinism is taught in the Bible. And we are out of time, so I'll conclude next.